Stephen, I always start my podcast interviews by asking, what were you like growing up? And what would you say were maybe some childhood experiences which shaped you?
Boy, what was I like growing up? I think I noticed a school report from when I was 7 years old, which said, "He is full of spirit and determination. He should go far," which I thought was actually quite a good. So full of spirit and determination was at least somebody else's version of what I was like. I think, I was always a person who was got interested in different kinds of things and did all sorts of different kinds of projects. And so at any given time, it was always like, I'm going to do this. I'm interested in this. I'm interested in that. Back in I was growing up in the 1960s when space was sort of a big thing. And I got interested in that and followed that. And sort of every deep space probe became a personal friend type thing. And that kind of segued into being interested in physics and science. And so when I was probably 10, 11 years old, I kind of got sort of seriously interested in learning about those kinds of things and discovered this amazing fact that you can learn stuff just by reading books. You don't need to listen to some teacher telling you things. You can just learn it by reading books. And sort of that, I think at that time I was, my self-image was that I was a sort of average kid. If you actually look back, I was probably sort of because there were all these ranks of, in British schools, I was usually the top kid or close to the top kid in all these different metrics in sort of the fanciest schools and so on. But that wasn't my self-image at the time. The thing that if you'd asked me, what is the thing that you do that you actually care most about? I was doing physics and things, and I was quite quickly doing physics research and so on. And that was kind of a separate track for me from the learning Latin and Greek and all those kinds of things that one did in those days as a kid.
Absolutely. I was going to actually talk about education, but I'll save that for later. One thing I wanted to ask you about, you said there about your self-image. What was your self-image? Because I understand that you were going through all these different topics that were of interest to you and possibly not learning all about the topic at school. You were going off on your own, going to libraries and doing the work yourself. What would you have thought of yourself? As in, you said that you were amongst other bright children. Did you not feel or sense you were different to anyone else when you consider the fact that you were, I think, publishing science papers at 14?
Yeah, look, I wasn't, I had the good fortune, even in, kindergarten or whatever, to be around a bunch of bright kids. So it was, in fact, it took me a long time before I found a place where there was a group of kids as bright as the ones that I knew in kindergarten, or a group of people as bright as the kids I knew in kindergarten. So that was a good start, so to speak. I mean, I think I wasn't really thinking about myself that much from the outside, so to speak. It's just like, I'm doing this stuff. The physics things that I did, I mostly did just as a sort of personally, I'm doing this because I'm interested in it. Yes, I started publishing papers because that's what one does if one's doing physics kinds of things. But it wasn't like I was telling people, look at all this amazing stuff I'm doing. In fact, there's a lot of things that I wrote at that time that I didn't show to anybody for 30 years. I finally put them on the web a few years ago. But they were kind of, it was done for kind of internal purposes that I think I would just say, well, I'm interested in this stuff. And that's why I'm studying it.
Absolutely. And obviously it's a theme throughout your life that you continue to go down these rabbit holes. Can I just ask one more thing about childhood? What were your parents like in terms of encouraging you? Because there'd be some kids whose parents would probably say, you don't need to be bothering about this. You're far too young. I assume your parents were very encouraging.
No, I mean, my parents, I would say, I would characterize them as not knowing very much about kids. And so, I was sort of an only child for the first 10 years of my life. And it's like, well, what are kids supposed to do? Are kids supposed to go off and, study physics and things like that? They didn't know. And so it was, and I think, they were, and the things I was doing were things that they knew little about. I mean, my father ran a business for many years and also wrote novels as kind of a side thing. And my mother was a philosophy professor in Oxford. And I think, the things that I did, and somehow I think this is the thing children sometimes do, sometimes they don't, is you do things that are different from what your parents do. And for example, I always used to say, if there's one thing I'll never do, it's philosophy. And it's kind of funny now because like I was just doing a podcast yesterday about philosophy with somebody. So it turns out the apple perhaps didn't fall as far from the tree as the young me would have claimed it did. But no, I don't think most of the things I did, I don't think I ever really talked to my parents about. And since they didn't know sort of what kids were supposed to do, there wasn't really a there was nothing much to no particular interaction about it.
I think what's interesting is when there isn't a model for something, so you were, like you said, an only child for 10 years, had you had an older sibling, perhaps they would have had more different rules. But I mean, I've got a child who's an only child. I've actually just started homeschooling him as well. And I feel like when something hasn't been modeled, then the world is your oyster, because you can go and be free and pick up topics and areas that normally at school would be constrained to certain age groups.
Yes.
Technology is obviously another massive passion of yours. And I wanted to ask you, when did you first get excited about technology?
I think I was excited about the future before I was excited about technology. And, I think that somehow the kind of, as I say, I was interested in, space and spacecraft and things, which is sort of technology, but it's more kind of what's the world going to be like in the future? There are things that are going to be sort of more interesting in the future, I thought. I got, I suppose I'm a pragmatic user of technology. I got my first kind of exposure to an actual computer, which in those days was the size of a large desk, when I was 12 years old. And I was not, it was not like, it's so cool that it's this big machine and so on. It's more, I can do interesting things with it. And that's kind of been my attitude, I think, to technology ever since. Now, it isn't to say that when a new piece of technology comes out, I'll be an early person in line to buy the latest gadget, because I do like to understand what technology can do. But I would say it's more the what it can do than, and I understand the workings of the technology because I want to do things with it, not because it's sort of an end in itself, so to speak.
Absolutely. So what's a light bulb moment for you when you realized that perhaps the computer was going to be a massive part of your career path? I know that you were looking at computational languages and everything like that from an early age, well, as early as you could. But when did you start using computers seriously?
When I was 12, 13 years old. I mean,
Okay.
I was actually my most serious early effort was studying a physics problem that was tipped off to by the cover of a book that I bought. I know exactly when I bought it because in those days I actually wrote the dates when I bought books in them. So it was June of 1972, so when I was 12 years old. It had this particular illustration of a physical process of gas molecules bouncing around in a box and becoming more random and so on. And I was interested in that. And I thought, I'm going to reproduce the picture in this book and understand more about it on a computer. And that was sort of my first serious kind of computer effort. It didn't work. Actually, in subsequent years, I realized that I actually did discover something that later I would find out was really, really interesting, but I didn't know what to look for at the time. And so at that time, it just looked like it didn't work. But that was kind of my earliest serious effort. It's kind of a funny thing about life that I finally, 50 years after that moment, I finally kind of finished understanding that phenomenon. I even wrote a book about it this last year about the second law of thermodynamics. And so that's my longest running project that I started and didn't yet finish. Is that 50-year span. And it's kind of satisfying to be able to finish it after that 50-year sort of span of time. But that was the first sort of big computer effort. Then I started using computers to do calculations in physics and so on. And I discovered that it gives you a kind of superpower to be able to think about things, then have the computer help you, then you see what it did and you think about it some more and so on. I suppose if there wasn't really a light bulb moment, but a light bulb period, it was that I was probably 15, 16 years old or something, and was using computers a bunch to do physics, was managing to achieve all kinds of interesting things with that. And I kind of didn't really internalize the question of why were other people not doing the same thing? Because these tools were not, I mean, they were a little bit difficult to use and to wrangle and so on, but they weren't, I mean, it could have been done by other people, but for some reason they weren't doing it. And so I had this kind of unreasonable advantage, so to speak. And I think at the time I just would have said, well, it's an obvious thing to do. And, I didn't really internalize so much this, wait a minute, why are other people not doing this? But so then what happened was I was using a bunch of tools that had been developed out in the world. And in 1979, which was when I was 20 years old, I guess, I just got my PhD, and it was like, okay, I'm going to make this plan for what I'm going to do sort of later in life, so to speak. Part of the plan was, look, I need to be using computational tools, and I'd kind of outgrown the tools that other people had built. And so that was the moment when I decided, very definite time in November of 1979, that it's like, I've got to build my own system for doing this. And that was probably the moment at which I got much more serious about these kinds of things and said, I've got to figure out how to make this work. Then after that, it's funny how these things happen, because the few years after that, I was back to doing basic science, trying to solve these problems about sort of how do complex things happen in the world. And that was the thing that I ended up doing, was sort of using a bunch of ideas about computation, which I now realize many years later, I thought of using because of the experience that I'd had in building a practical computer system. At the time, it was just like, well, this is the obvious thing to do. But later on, when you say, why hadn't this been done zillions of years earlier? It's because one had to have had that experience alongside experience of doing physics and things like this to think of that. And, it's not something I mean, in more recent years, partly because I've sort of been interested in planning things, partly because I've studied history quite a bit. I ask more the question, why did other people not see to do this? But I wasn't asking it back in those days.
I don't think, looking back at your history, that there's ever a time where you've been constrained by rules or regulations or people. It's like you take your own path, you forged your own path. And I think that's part of your success. But talking about edge there, I wanted to ask you, you've talked before, I think, is it called thinking apparatus? The system.
Well, I don't know. No, I sometimes refer to thinking apparatus as telling people, keep the thinking apparatus engaged when you're studying different kinds of things, because people tend not to. They tend to say, I'm a physicist. Okay, I'm going to run a business. Wait a minute. I don't have to, the things that I know, to ways of thinking that I have in, let's say, physics, that's not something I'm going to engage when I think about running a business, which I think is a mistake. But for me, the thing, you're right, I've tried to figure out what to do for myself and then go see how to do it, so to speak. And I've been lucky, I suppose, that the things that I've chosen to do are things that I sort of have the platform to be able to do. But it's not wholly luck, because there are things where I say, look, I could in principle do that, but I don't have the platform to be able to do it. Let me not do that. Let me do something different, because there's quite a lot of things that I want to do. But the thing that's been sort of surprising to me in my life is that I've sort of alternated between doing basic science and doing technology development and so on, probably about 5 times in my life so far. And, if I look at what I've been able to do, it's kind of this tower that's ended up being built, where the things that I can do now happen because of the things that I did in the past. It wasn't particularly planned that way. It's kind of an opportunism of the things which I kind of, vaguely thought about doing. And then I realized, gosh, I've now got the ability to actually go ahead and do this. And it's, particularly some things recently in basic science, in our efforts to understand fundamental theory of physics and so on. It's a very strange feeling, because I realized that if you move almost any brick in this tower, one wouldn't have got to that point. And it's very strange that it's kind of a strange, an accident just missed, so to speak, that it was actually possible to get there, and that it didn't get derailed by many things that could have been different.
It's also really interesting. I mean, I think it was Steve Jobs that said you can only connect the dots looking back. But you're right about this kind of tower block. And it's always interesting because some people will be distracted from projects, like some of the projects you do, ridiculous amounts of time, in the sense that you've put so much effort and time in, a decade, if we talk about new kind of science and things like that. What is it, do you think? What are the traits that allow you to keep focused? Because I've interviewed other scientists, and that's one of the things they talk about, that when you're looking at a new concept or paradigm, there's often a lot of naysayers, and these people can cause a few headaches if you listen to them. What would you say gives you the edge in terms of allowing you to keep going?
A certain amount of confidence, arrogance, and not really caring what other people have to say, which is, I sometimes, I'd been lucky that I did a bunch of projects early in my life that worked out pretty well. And so that meant that I thought, okay, I can do projects, even if they're pretty difficult. They're probably going to work out well. In fact, I don't think I've ever sort of seriously embarked on a project that didn't work out. And sometimes the definition of the project changed, but the project, in sort of, if you look at it, did that project work out? The answer is yes. And after, you keep doing that, you become more confident for the next project, so to speak. And in terms of, any sufficiently innovative project, people are not going to understand it. You're the one who's going to understand it, not, pretty much everything I've done. If I'd said to people, wait a minute, should I do this? Is this a good idea? People would have said, no, that's crazy. But I didn't ask them most of the time. And, I don't know, I'm sure there are, I'm sure you can find on the web people saying, this is going to fail, this is a terrible thing. I don't read those things. It's not, it's a thing where, there are more extreme versions, like when we built this, our Wolfram Alpha system, back in the mid-aughts, so to speak. I had the issue, I have a company with hundreds of people in it, and we have successful products, and then I'm going to do this thing that, to most people, even within my own company, are like, this is not going to work. And so there was, I think, at the peak, I was sort of hiding about 200 people working on this kind of skunk works project, so to speak, that I didn't see the point in engaging with the main team at the company, because they were just going to tell me it's not going to work. And no, to their credit, once we'd gotten it to the point where it did work, it was, it took about an hour demoing it for people to say, wow, this is really cool. This is how we can use it in other places, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was definitely the right decision to not sort of, as it was being built, engage with people and have them say, it's not going to work, this thing doesn't work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same thing when I wrote A New Kind of Science, which was a decade-long project. At the very beginning of that, I was sort of talking to people a bit about it. And, part of it was, oh, I don't know what the point of this is. Or actually more harmful still was, this is really cool, what about this? Whether this was something that wasn't in my path, and actually the things that I'd figured out I should do were a nice coherent set, and those were the things that were only going to take a decade to do, so to speak. If I'd chased every rabbit down its hole, so to speak, for all the things other people said I should do, I wouldn't have finished it in a lifetime.
I was going to say about that book, I ordered it just before Christmas, and I was quite surprised to get this huge 1,000-page plus book turn up. You put so much into it, like we said, 10-year project. With all your work, there are lengthy periods of time where you're going deep into it. What is the kind of result once it's out there? Because I find that, I've written a couple of books, nothing, by the way, nothing compared to yours. But I'm just curious, like, once it's out there in the world, does it take a toll? Because I imagine while you're in the project, like you said, you get these incremental wins which keep you going. And I'm sure it's invigorating writing about this stuff. But once it's out in the world, does it do you kind of crash and burn, or are you just on to the next thing?
I'm on to the next thing. I mean, in fact, in the case of that book, one of the things that was I spent a bunch of time interacting with the world about that book, traveling around, talking to people, and I built certain systems like a summer school and things, which still goes on today, for people who want to learn about what's in that book and how to do things based on it and so on, because it wasn't feasible for me to go and sort of personally do all those interactions. But I think in doing a project, like a 10-year project, for example, there's a certain kind of dogged tenacity that one has to have to get the thing done. And I think, in a sense, I consider with that project, the biggest achievement of that project was getting it done. Because in addition to doing that, I was CEOing a company and things like that while I was working on that project. And it took, continual focus every single day, lots of time. And I think, I don't know, I suppose that a thing that happens to me is that I get these projects, I'm going to do this. I'm a sufficiently kind of determined character that I'm just, once I've started it, I'm going to finish it. And I found, and that's it, is it locally, if you ask me, are you having fun doing it? Sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I'm just, doggedly doing it, so to speak. I think in terms of books are funny because when a book is done, it's done. Apart from maybe going and promoting it and talking to people about it. Software, for example, doesn't have that characteristic. I mean, the things that, we started building in what's now Wolfram Language back in 1986, we just brought out version 14 a couple of weeks ago, and it's a thing, that's a thing you live with kind of every day, so to speak. It's not it's over with type of thing. Same is true with building companies and so on. It's something where, I know that I long ago signed up for, I never get to take a vacation, ever. I mean, in other words, it's, I've been running my company for 36 years now. Every time I even think about, wait a minute, let me take a day off, something will happen, which doesn't usually, most days, nothing happens that's so dramatic that I have to deal with it. But somehow there was this phenomenon where every time I would consider, like, let me maybe think about taking this day off, it's like something happens that I have to deal with, and it's like, well, I can't do that now. So I gave up. And so it's kind of like one's signed up for this kind of lifetime commitment, so to speak, which is, which, as far as I'm concerned, is okay. It wouldn't be, I can see there are, for example, for somebody like me, it's much easier to be in charge of a thing, responsible for the thing, and having to make all kinds of decisions where oh, there's a risk with this decision, blah, blah, blah. That's much less stressful for me than being in a situation where there's some, group of people who are supposed to be coming to some kind of consensus about what to do, and I'm trying to persuade other people. I hate that. I'm not very good at it. I hate it. It's, for me, it's much easier to just let me decide what I want to do for myself and then try and make it happen, so to speak. Knowing that, sometimes I'll make mistakes and, minor disasters will happen, but it's, I much prefer it that way.
When you were saying there about the holiday, I just remember a story from Elon Musk, not to compare you to him at all, but I think he said he once went on holiday and got malaria and almost died. And that was like all the lesson he needed, never to take a break again. So I don't think he's had a holiday either. I'm going to jump around a bit because I think there's so many interesting topics that we could talk about. But I did mention earlier on about education. As someone who has, as I said earlier, forged your own path, you've also got 4 kids and you've gone into these deeply technical fields. And obviously a lot of it, you've said from the start, you kind of pursued yourself. What do you think of school education in terms of how do we create more polymaths? I'm always wondering why we don't have more polymaths. And I thought, well, maybe it's the way the school system is set up. So as someone who has set up, I know you've done the summer school, I think you've got Wolfram Institute, and you've got these live Q&As for kids, which are fantastic. If you could reimagine education, what would it look like? What subjects would you get rid of? What ones would you keep?
Right. I think one thing to realize about education is, all people are all different. And what's a great education plan for one person might not be for somebody else. I mean, the structure of the world, the kind of streamlined education that has existed for the last 100, 150 years in most places, doesn't really have the freedom to be customized for each individual kid. That isn't, so, if you ask, I don't know, for my kids did a bunch of homeschooling, they did a bunch of, some of them did other things that, it's been different for different kids. And I think the, in terms of one of the things that has tended to happen, right, as education gets more kind of streamlined and industrialized, so the thing turns into, we've got to have these standardized tests. We've got to teach things where we can kind of put them on a production line, so to speak. And they can, it's much easier to teach something mechanical than it is to teach something less well-defined, something that involves, actual sort of creative thinking and so on. And unfortunately, people will say, well, we're going to teach, creative thinking, and then they're going to, but they try and put that on an industrial production line, and it becomes quite silly. Because it's like, to be creative, you do 1, 2, 3, 4, which is kind of defeats the idea of being creative. So I think I did an exercise once with one of my kids actually, who was you look at the encyclopedia and you ask what fraction of the encyclopedia is taught in would you learn about if you just went through standard school. I think the answer is between a quarter and a third, okay, of things you would sort of touch on in some way or another, topic areas. There's a lot you wouldn't. That has the feature that, for example, those areas of the world are completely unknown to kids. And I think one of the things that I've been interested in is sort of how do kids know what's out there in the world? How do they figure out what they might be really excited about? Because the thing that, for me, for example, I'm a person who learns when I have an objective. If you say to me, just learn the subject for the sake of learning the subject, even now, I basically can't do that. It's, so I'm kind of a project-driven person. I'm also not really a competitive person. That is, if you say to me, you should do this because you're going to be able to win be the top of the leaderboard, I'm like, I don't care. That's my particular thing. I mean, because my particular egotistical, twist or something is the things I'm most interested in doing are the things that I think I can uniquely do. And by the time I'm sort of competing with, 100 other people to do it, I kind of know it's unique to me because, everybody's in the same race type thing. And, I tend to avoid those things. So for me, that's not a motivator, but for some people, that is a good motivator. So, I think this question about sort of, can you find something that, really resonates with you? I think the sooner people do that in their lives, even if maybe they get the first thing they come up with isn't the thing that ends up being the final thing, even having something where you say, I really care about this, and I'm going to, try to pursue this is very helpful. And I think a lot of kind of, in the way that school is set up, it's just like there's this giant production line, there's many pieces to it. By the time you get into sort of elite type schooling, it's like, and not only do you have the main production line, you also have all these side production lines of all the extra activities. And pretty soon everybody is so unbelievably busy that they have no moment to sort of think about anything that isn't part of the production line, so to speak. So, I mean, I think that's, at the level of sort of the big picture, it's, also I should say that a lot of what's being done is teaching mechanism, not teaching sort of how to think about things. It's teaching how do I mechanically do a piece of math or something like this. Now, there is one, in terms of content, the big area that is, I think, sort of the critical area is this kind of computational thinking thing. And, the way I like to think about it, it's really kind of a big deal in the history of sort of intellectual development of our species. I mean, first, the first thing we had to sort of formalize what's going on in the world is human language. which, has been the big win for our species relative to all others, I think. And then, then we got logic, then we got mathematics, and now sort of the new way to sort of formalize thinking about the world is computational thinking. And by the way, computers help you do that. So you kind of get this extra sort of boost from, if you think about things computationally, if you formulate your thinking computationally, then the computer can help you do it, and can sort of give you sort of the superpower beyond, once you can think about things computationally, you can control this kind of superpower that takes you a long way. And it's pretty clear that the future of pretty much every domain, call it X, is kind of a computational X. And if there was one thing that kids should learn, it's how to do kind of computational thinking. Now you might say, how should they do that? Well, I built a bunch of tools that kind of one can think of as being the main tools that kind of provide kind of the notation and language for thinking about things computationally. But if you ask the question, well, is there a textbook you can read about computational thinking? The answer, sadly, is not really, which is why, in fact, a project that I'm currently doing is trying to write such a thing, which I'm sort of frustrated to have to do myself, because I figure that there's just, there's a lot of people who know this is important. And it's kind of one of these, but as I get into doing it, I actually realize it's not quite as easy as one might have thought. There are a lot of kinds of things that, one's basically building a way of teaching a thing that has never systematically been taught. And so there's a lot to invent in how that works. And so that makes it interesting for me, even though I'm a little frustrated to have to do this project. But in terms of what people should be learning, computational thinking is the thing that is going to let people sort of attach to the superpower of computation. Now, it is sort of structurally in education, it's a very difficult thing, because computational thinking is probably the first sort of really major new paradigm for thinking about things that has come into existence during the time that sort of streamlined education has existed. There's never before been something really big that there have been tools like, the web or computers in general and so on. But in terms of the core, sort of how do people think about things, this is the first really new thing that's come into existence during that period of time. And how should one then deal with it? Well, I think it's a long, complicated problem, because, there's this giant machine of education that exists, and sort of turning the operation of that is really hard. And for example, that is not my expertise. I mean, this is my sort of, the things I tend to do are, define what can be done and go and do it, not, sort of get the world to turn all this kind of complicated machinery in the direction of doing those kinds of things. But I think in terms of content, that is clearly that's the big thing in terms of content that is important going forward. I think that, by the way, I mean, as I even write about sort of computational thinking kinds of things, I think there is sort of the opportunity to actually inject the idea of thinking into sort of the process of education, partly because, given that sort of the computer is helping you, the mechanism, the sort of mechanical stuff becomes very obviously irrelevant. And what doesn't become irrelevant, by the way, is learning actual facts and content. I mean, one of the things that I realize, even in writing about sort of computational thinking, is, this book, course, whatever, it'll turn into lots of different things, is going to have all kinds of sections about actual stuff like molecular biology or, systems engineering or whatever else. These actual content areas, which, by the way, are vastly easier to explain in a computational thinking framework than they would be without that. I mean, just incredibly much easier to explain. One of my exercises is, can I have a small section that basically teaches calculus, which people usually think of this as a big challenge and you've got to learn all these different things. I don't think that's true. I mean, I've tried it, obviously, on lots of kids. It seems to work out fairly well. Once you have the bigger ideas of computational thinking, then going in and saying, hey, there's this application and it's calculus, for example, seems to become fairly easy. Now, what you're learning there is sort of what calculus is, how to use it, and so on. You're not necessarily learning all the tricks that a human might be able to use to be able to solve this integral, which, by the way, a computer can do in 1,000th of a second. Doesn't use the same tricks that humans use. Does it in a much less interesting, in some sense, mechanical kind of way. But so, I mean, I think the thing that, one of the things to emphasize is, the fact that one's teaching something that has the word thinking in its name does not mean that there aren't lots of facts. I think that the sort of anchoring what one's learning to sort of just knowing a lot of stuff about the world. I mean, you talk about polymaths and so on, part of the way you get there is just by knowing a bunch of stuff, which amounts to a bunch of facts. I mean, what I always notice is there are facts you can learn, and then there's kind of a way of thinking about things. And every different field has a somewhat different way of thinking about things. And that's you already get quite a long way by just knowing the facts. Then to know the way of thinking, if you're going to be a pure mathematician, there's a certain way of thinking about things. If you're going to be an economist, there's a certain way of thinking about things. Those are harder to learn, but you can't learn them at all if you don't have, you have no hope if you don't have the underlying facts. And I think sort of the computational thinking thing allows one, I think, to span a lot of areas, but to sort of be able to have, you need to base it on the facts of those areas. So those are really worth learning.
When are you going to have this ready? This is something I want to see out in the world.
Well, yes, I don't know. I just started. I'm on chapter 3. It's probably going to be 40 or 50 chapters. So,
oh my God. Okay.
I mean, see, this is one thing about doing big projects is if you ask me, I mean, my internal view of this project is I'm just going to work on it every day and it'll get done when it gets done. If I started to think to myself, oh my gosh, this is going to take me a year, 2 years, whatever else, I might start freaking out. Much better that I just am like, I'm taking it, one day at a time. I'm going to just keep writing it. I don't know. I don't think it's going to take that long, but I don't really know.
Time will tell.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that and I'm trying to figure out whether I should release incremental pieces of it, which I may. The only constraint on that is the thing about if you release incremental pieces and people keep telling you, you should change that, you should change this, you should change this, you'll never get the whole thing done.
You have to ignore them, Stephen, like you said before.
Absolutely. Right. I know. I mean, that's no, I think, but it's, yeah, so it's sort of an interesting process to think through this field of computational thinking. It's sort of a humbling thing, and it usually is with the kinds of projects I do, that this is a field I've been thinking about for nearly 50 years now. You would think I could just sit and I know exactly what to say. Turns out it's not true, because I've never quite introspected some of the kinds of things that one needs to talk about, and so that makes it interesting for me. I think one thing to say about projects and the projects one does is there's the question of, the next project, how does it stack up relative to all previous projects one's done? And, I know, one of the things that can be a trap in people's careers is you do a successful project, then you say, okay, every project I do from here on out has to be bigger, better, stronger than the successful project I did. That is not a trap that I tend to have, just because each project I get excited about, I'm going to do it. I have no idea whether this, for example, last year, I wrote this thing that took me a couple of weeks that was a explainer about ChatGPT, okay, which is probably the thing of mine which has the highest ratio of number of times it's been read to the effort that I put into writing it, okay? But it was not, the fact that I even did it was a comparatively easy thing for me to do. And it was, I wasn't thinking to myself, I'm doing this because it's the next great thing I'm doing. It's just, I'm doing this because I'm fed up with people asking me, how does ChatGPT work? I think I should just write it down. And it turned out that was a more unique effort, remains a completely unique effort of trying to explain what's going on, so to speak, at a reasonably high level, while still being grounded in sort of the technical details. And again, I when I started doing that, I was neither thinking about, look, are other people going to do similar things, nor was I thinking about, is this the sort of the very bestest thing I could do at this moment.
I think what's great about you and for most of your career is obviously there's a lot of kind of working in public that goes on with you, and even more so today. There's so many things that you've done and meetings that you've had that are now available for the public. I want to ask you, what are the benefits to the business of working like this?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that, well, there are some sort of small scale benefits. It's great, if you're doing product design, for example, and you have a live stream and a bunch of sort of world experts in that topic tune in and give you comments. That's useful. It's great that you meet people from around the world, so to speak, who have weird, incomprehensible handles, and you realize that's a really talented person. We should try and hire them. I wonder, where they are, who they are, what their story is. We have no idea. All we know is their handle. And that's been a successful thing. I think in terms of our, certainly for our internal teams, having just the kind of clean records of all these things that we figured out and decisions we've made, that's useful. I mean, we could do that without having them be streamed in public, but I think that the streaming in public thing kind of makes sure that people are sort of staying on topic through the whole meeting and so on. And one only gets to tell. I mean, I don't think the meetings that I do in public are really any different from meetings that I do not in public. The ones that I do not in public are usually they're probably less interesting because they're mostly, what's the status of this project? Has this team delivered this thing, which I think the public would find boring. And, there are dynamics of that don't really make sense in public. But in terms of the intellectual side of product design, that's been, I would say, a good thing there. I think in things like my sort of Q&A, science and technology Q&A for kids and others, and my various other live stream efforts of that kind, I started doing those at the beginning of the pandemic because I thought, let me do this public service. There are all these kids who are not in school, and I've done in person a bunch of times, Q&As for kids about science, and they seem to have fun. Let me just provide this as a public service. And then I realized it's really interesting for me to do this. I find it actually kind of relaxing. It's kind of like it's a bizarre process because you're just sitting down, you're looking at a camera, and you're yakking for an hour or so. But for me, I can tell that I have become a measurably better explainer of things as a result of doing that. And it's, in a sense, it's a very exacting thing because, as from these things, you're looking at the camera, you can't just, you're doing it live, you can't just stop and say, and it's, I think it's been, as I say, it's helped me to be better at explaining things. Quite often when I start explaining something in response to some question somebody asked that I'd never thought about before, I figure out something new. In fact, one of the challenges, which I haven't figured out how to solve, and I really should solve, is that occasionally I'm doing these live streams and I realize I just had a new idea that I'm now telling people about. And because I'm just doing this live stream, I'm not like taking a note to myself. That's an idea I should pay more attention to. So that remains one of the bugs in that kind of live streaming, is because you're kind of live to the audience all the time. You're not like, let me take a note of that type thing. And I find it sort of amusing that people will ask questions that range in terms of what's needed to answer them, from kind of high school level knowledge to, I just talked to the world expert in that a couple of weeks ago, and that's how I know the answer to this, to, I don't think that's ever been figured out before, but I just had an idea about how to figure it out right here and now, so to speak. And, I suppose it's a piece of perhaps internal amusement to me that I don't really make any distinction between those things in terms of what I'm explaining to people. And sometimes I'll mention that, people don't know about this, so this is a newly discovered thing, but it's kind of I suppose for me, it's sort of, I think it's sort of interesting that to have that kind of span of things which are well known and not. I feel like it's a I could say to the audience, gosh, if you paid attention in high school math, you would know this, but that's not my, I'm not interested in doing that. It's just like, let me try and explain it. I don't know what your background is, but let me try and do the best I can in explaining it.
That's fantastic. I always think, at school, we usually have, if we're lucky, we have one teacher that inspires us in some way or another. And it's usually the more intellectual of the teachers. And I think for you, because you're able to reach so many people, through the live streams all over the world, you're giving that to them. You're the kind of inspiring teacher that hopefully will spark an interest, because you've got this unwavering passion for the fields and you've had it for so long, and it's really contagious. So I must say thank you on behalf of the public for that. I've got a couple more left field kind of questions for you. Is there something that you worry about in terms of technology, or the way the kind of field of technology is going? Is there something that worries you that you don't think other people are talking about?
Gosh. I mean, in one of the general things in technology is there are great things that can be done, but the world kind of doesn't care and it does a totally mediocre thing. That's something that happens. And sometimes the fact that the mediocre thing got done kind of crowds out the really good thing that could get done. And for decades, if not longer, the world is stuck with something kind of mediocre. And I think there's certainly lots of dynamics of that kind that go on, which people, it's always, there's a certain, I would say, there can be a belief that that the world doesn't really care about good stuff. It just wants kind of okay stuff. And that means, and often there are things you can reach from the really good stuff that really you can't reach from the okay stuff. And lots of things that would be, I think, good in the world just won't happen if it's sort of crowded out by the just okay stuff. So I suppose that's one kind of thing. I think, I mean, in terms of, there's another type of issue, I suppose, is, okay, so the AIs are coming and they're going to do more and more stuff, and people think about kind of how do we make sure that the AIs do things we want them to do and not things we don't want them to do, and so on. There's a very basic kind of dilemma, which is sort of something that's come out of science that I've done from the 1980s on, and it has to do with this phenomenon I call computational irreducibility, which on sort of, when first described, it seems like this abstract thing. Why is it relevant to society and sort of the future and so on? But turns out that it is. And the thing is this: if you say, I'm defining a bunch of computational rules by which some system will operate, you might say, once I know the rules by which the system will operate, then I know everything about the system. But it's not true, because you might have to just run the rules and see what happens. There might be no way to jump ahead and say, so I know what the thing is going to do. In fact, one can show that will often be the case, that the system shows this phenomenon of computational irreducibility. You just have to explicitly do the computation to see what will happen. Okay, so if you're going to have a computational system kind of do the things that it can do, then you want it to do things where you can't just jump ahead and see what will happen. Because if you could jump ahead and see what would happen, why is it bothering to do what it's doing? And so, but this phenomenon, when you can't jump ahead and see what's going to happen, you also can't say, so I know the system will never do anything wrong. And so that means that you've got this choice. You either say, let's constrain our AI systems, our computational systems, to be ones that can't do the best they can, but can be constrained in some way or another. Or let's let these systems do the best they can, in which case they will do unexpected things that we can't foresee and that we can't constrain them about. So this is kind of a decision the world has to make. Do we want to say we only want machinery whose operation we can understand, or do we want machinery that does the most sophisticated things it can do? And I think people have not yet come to terms with that dichotomy. And by the way, it's, in a sense, it's this idea that there are things going on that we can't understand. If we look at the natural world, it's full of things going on that we can't understand. And we choose to try and make sort of slice off pieces of the natural world whose operation we do understand, and sort of live in connection with those pieces, and sort of try to ignore the pieces that we don't understand. And so there's sort of a similar issue coming with technology in general of do we let the technology be as sophisticated as it can be, or do we insist that it's technology that we can understand and constrain? And I think that will be a thing in coming decades. That will be a thing that in different forms keeps on manifesting, and people eventually realize that's the key question. And in the end, you have to think about it like you think about nature. It's a thing that does what it does, and you have to kind of exist alongside it and figure out sort of in what niche you exist, rather than saying let's just sort of try and constrain the whole thing.
That's really interesting. I was going to ask you actually what side you fall on, but I think you made it clear. I have got one last question, which I ask everyone. I always ask people, because I start at the very beginning and I always like to go back there. I want to ask you if there's one piece of advice that you could offer a younger Stephen. And I know, by the way, that your career, like you said, you built this tower block. There's nothing I know that you'd want to change about your career. But if there was one particular time when you were younger that maybe things were difficult, what's one piece of advice, looking back, you would offer him?
It's so complicated because a lot of things where, first of all, I wouldn't have listened. That's the first statement to make. Some kinds of advice that one might listen to, kind of, I'll give you an analogy here. So there was a time in the history of our company when we developed really good methodology for predicting how long projects would take. And we started telling people, you're working on this project, it's going to be finished in X amount of time. It was a disaster, because as soon as you told people this project is going to take 18 months, it didn't take 18 months anymore. It was, so, I mean, I think there's there are things like it's very hard to answer that because it's kind of a time travel like question, and it's kind of you could say, well, I should have kind of sort of had more fun doing this or that thing, but at the time I wouldn't have been interested in that. In retrospect, maybe it's I'm not sure. I mean, I think that one thing that certainly is notable to me in retrospect is I learned all these different subjects and things, and some of them at the time I'm like, why am I learning this? Like Latin and Greek are two great examples of this. And then I find, years later, that it turns out that well, the things that I learned about Latin grammar and so on are pretty useful to me later on. And even knowing those languages is useful when you have to make up names for things later in life. And I suppose so one of the things would be sort of don't complain so much about the things you're having to learn right now, because actually they will turn out to be useful later. But I wouldn't have listened to that. And in some sense, had I sort of paid more attention to those things and less attention to the things that I was sort of passionately interested in, I might never have gotten to the point where those things turned out to be useful. So I'm bad at this sort of time travel type question. I think it's I suppose if I look at, I certainly do like to examine decisions I've made and which ones were a mistake and which ones weren't a mistake. I think the one that was sort of, I was an academic, fairly successful academic, but I did not fit in that world in many ways, much too entrepreneurial for that world, much too kind of, I have this objective, I don't care that it, doesn't fit into this whole structure, I'm just going to go after that objective. I think that had I understood that point earlier, that might have been helpful to me. Actually, I will give you one piece of yes. Okay, this is one sort of. So back when I was 20 years old or so, I sort of was getting backed into starting my first company, and at the time, my self-image was, I'm a kind of science kid type person. What do I know about running companies? And so on. What do I know about organizing things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I brought in a CEO to run that company. Big mistake. The fact is, it was, in retrospect, it was already sort of pretty evident that I was not totally inept at like running things, because if I looked at what I'd actually done, I'd organized many things in my life with other people and so on. But my self-image was, I'm so sort of heavily invested in the kind of science academic thing that meant, I couldn't be sort of usefully capable on the kind of business organizational side. And that was a mistake. And I think it is something where somebody could probably have pointed out to me, but it would have taken a degree of sophistication and sort of knowledge of me that I'm not sure, I didn't have it for myself, so to speak. I'm not sure anybody else could reasonably have had it. I always find, as I end up giving all sorts of advice to other people, and I like to learn from the sort of the things that where I didn't see something about myself. It's useful when you're sort of trying to give advice to other people to sort of push them into the things which they haven't seen about themselves, so to speak. And I think of course, the whole business about giving advice to people, it's always and it relates even to the older me to younger me story, is it's often the case that advice given is more about the person giving the advice than it is about the person to whom the advice is being given, because one has a tremendous habit of kind of thinking, this is what's worked for me, it's the way to do things, so to speak. I would say, again, the older to younger story, there are things that work for me today that well, I'll give you an example of that. The whole thing about being interested in education, which I am now, being interested in history, which I am now. The younger me wasn't interested in either of those things. If I had told the younger me, you should be interested in these things, I just would have said that, well, I'm not. It's like both of those things are things for which probably I have some I have some capability and some orientation towards those things, but when I was younger, even though that might have nascently existed, I certainly would have ignored any advice in that direction.
It's funny how it all turns out. Stephen, thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks. It was fun.
Brilliant. All right. Take care, Stephen.
Oh, this was fun. You asked good
Brilliant.
questions.
Thank you.